All right, here we are for yet another amazing experience. And of course, our third and final interview guest for tonight is Mr. Milton Davis. Thank you very much, Mr. Davis, for coming on the show. I really appreciate you. Like, first off, tell us all about yourself, sir.
Well, I'm a writer and a publisher. I've been writing for 10 years now. The company I have is MV Media LLC. Actually, been writing since 2005. Been publishing since 2008. So it's going on 11 years now. It'll be 11 years in May. And I basically write science fiction and fantasy based on African American culture and traditions.
Awesome. So, I'd like to know, like, I've heard a whole lot about what you do. I've read a couple of your books. And one I never got around to was the whole, like, the dark universe. But I've heard a lot about it. So could you enlighten me as to the dark universe?
Well, dark universe is a storyline, a concept that's built around an Afrocentric galactic empire. We were basically playing with some ideas, me and Gene Peterson, and so we came up with this concept. And the foundation of it is about, it starts with a gentleman by the name of, I can't even think of the name of my own characters, Cornelius Cassidy. And Cornelius Cassidy is this billionaire. He's this black billionaire, African American. And in this future world, there's a company called Environ that's basically terraforming and selling planets. And most of their business is with governments. You know, you've got different economic groups like NAFTA and European Union, African Union that are buying planets out in the world, out in the galaxy, for mining, settlement, different things like that. So Cornelius Cassidy decides that he's going to buy a planet, and this planet is going to be for reestablishing black people in a world where they can just get away from all the other stuff that's going on Earth. And so he buys this planet. He kind of does it undercover. He's one of the first private enterprises to buy a planet from Environ. And then he sends out his son to recruit the people to come to this planet. And they were expecting, like, large droves of black people to come and say, hey, we're going to go up our own planet. We wanted to, but they only got 1 million people that would do it. And so these people all migrate to Cassidy. That's what they call the planet. And it starts off as like a corporate planet, basically. It's owned by the Cassidy Corporation. But over the decades, it starts to evolve. And as the government planets start to fight against each other, Cassidy's just kind of like sitting back, not being involved with anybody, kind of steadily building their power. At some point, they see, okay, the universe is ripe for takeover. Everybody's weak, but we've built ourselves up. Right before that starts to happen, there's a thing that we call, it's kind of like a galactic EMP, and it wipes out basically all technology throughout the galaxy.
Oh.
And so the universe goes through a dark age. But Cassidy, because of some of the technology that it had was protected from the EMP, recovers first. But by this time, the planet's no longer being called Cassidy. There's a woman that Ziara, who is like the legacy of the Cassades, because it's gone from being a corporate planet to more like a kingdom in a way. She regains a lot of the knowledge, and then she sets out to reunite the universe. And they renamed the planet after her. They started calling it Ziara after her. And the family is now called the Cassades. And they end up establishing what we call the first galactic empire. And it's the Cassade Empire. And that's what the Dark Universe is all based on.
Oh, so that's where the name the Cassade. Oh, wow.
That's where that comes from.
Wow.
The first book, what we did is that we selected particular writers to contribute to this anthology. Usually our anthologies are open anthologies, but we had certain writers that we admired, certain writers that we knew that focused on writing science fiction.
Mm-hmm.
And so we approached them and said, hey, we've got this anthology, we've got this storyline, would you contribute to that? And they were like, yeah. So the first book kind of like tells the whole story of the empire from beginning to when it collapsed. Mm-hmm. And good stories and stuff, but Penelope, who was one of the writers, says, we've got this great empire we created, this world we created, and all we're writing about is when it collapsed. You know, maybe we should write some stories about when it was in its heyday. You know, so that's when we got the idea of the Bright Empire, and these are stories written about the empire when it was at its peak.
Nice.
But it was starting to show some weaknesses and stuff. But at the time, it's really at its peak. And like you have the what do you call the Pax Romana, the Roman peace.
Yeah.
They were going through what we call the Cassad Alafia. Alafia is Yoruba for peace. So basically, they're going through that period and stuff. So it shows that kind of stuff. So that's the whole background behind the whole Dark Universe storyline. And we've got a few more anthologies planned for down the road. We're starting to work on the third one, which is called The New Regime. And then we've got another one that's going to be called Interregnum that's going to come out after that. But I'm thinking we're probably going to end up with like about at least 6 anthologies and stuff.
Wow.
Yeah.
So how did you even get into writing in the first place? Like, what? How did you get from how did you get to here? Like,
it's an interesting story. I just told it to somebody out there. I've written since I was young, but it wasn't something that I actually looked at something that was like a passion. I would do it when I had ideas. When I was in the 5th grade, I wrote a play that they ended up doing for the PTA.
What?
You know, it was an art project we had, but it was nothing that I really did. I wasn't really encouraged to do it, but I wasn't discouraged.
Right.
You know, but when I got in college, I had an instructor, Anna Holloway. She's actually a Facebook friend of mine now. That the first essay I wrote in her class, she said, "I need you to come by my office." I'm like, "Okay, what do I do?" And she said, "I just read your essay." And she said, "What are you doing as a chemistry major? You should be a writer."
Wow.
And I said, "Well, writers don't make any money." So I said, so that sounds good, but I'm going to be a chemist, and I'm going to make millions of dollars as a chemist. Little did I know that wasn't going to happen either. But she started, I guess, I tell everybody it was part of her plan because she introduced me to science fiction. Mm-hmm. She was bringing me books like by Asimov, Arthur C. Clarke, different people like that. So I'm reading this science fiction. I'm like, this is pretty cool. I like this stuff. And then she said, well, I think you could write this. And I'm like, I'll give it a shot. So I started writing little stories and short stories, and she would read them and say, hey, this is pretty good. So that kind of got me interested in doing it. When I graduated from college, I went through the process, writing stories, sending them to editors, worked my way up from getting form rejections to where the editors were actually reading the stories and sending stuff back to me saying, hey, I thought that was a great story, but it's not exactly for my magazine. And they would recommend other magazines and stuff. I'm like, okay, I'm getting pretty good at this kind of stuff and that kind of thing. I also took a Writer's Digest course. I used to read the magazine all the time, so I took a course from them. Then I took another course at Emory University, which was like a continuing education course on writing and stuff. But then life got in the way. Got married, kids, and had other things going on with my chemistry career and stuff like that. And then in 2005, that's when I kind of sat down and said, is there anything that you wanted to do that you've never done before? And I said, I've always wanted to write a novel. So that's when I really got serious about writing. I decided I wanted to self-publish because I had my own business before. So I wanted to kind of control everything. And all the research I had done about publishing kind of indicated to me that if I tried to publish the kind of stories I wanted to publish through mainstream publishers, they probably wouldn't do well. So I said, look, I'm very serious about this. I want to tell these stories a certain way, so I'm going to self-publish. So I started writing in 2005. I finished Meji, I finished Changa, and then in 2008, that's when I actually started publishing and releasing books and stuff. That's what I've been doing since then.
Yeah, you've been doing pretty well. I mean, my God, so seeing as how you took classes and stuff, would you recommend that to other writers, like up and coming writers? Would you recommend taking classes?
I do, because there are people who are naturals at everything, and some people are natural writers. But I think you need to take the classes, even if it's just to confirm that you are the writer that you think you are, and you also end up learning the language of writing. you may know what a simile and a metaphor is, but you may not know what it's actually called. Mm-hmm. And when you start learning the language of writing and stuff like that, then when you start writing, you can be more precise because you know exactly what you're doing, what you're calling, and stuff like that kind of thing. So to me, and you learn how to structure and how to tell a story. Mm-hmm. That's what you learn there. I mean, some people say, you learn the rules so you can break the rules, mm-hmm. And that's kind of the same thing with writing. Before you can start saying, I'm going to write something different, you got to know what different is. Yeah. You got to know what's standard before you can write something different and stuff. So I always that's one of the first things I tell people. They say, I want to be a writer. The first thing I ask them is that, have you ever taken any writing classes? And they'll say, well, no, I haven't. I said, well, do that first. I'm not telling you to go out and get a degree in creative writing. I'm not telling you to need to, major in English. I'm just saying, take some classes, confirm what you think, mm-hmm. Or learn or realize that, hey, I didn't know as much about this as I thought I did. So now I'm learning this stuff. So this is going to make me a better writer. Right. That's what I look at.
All right. Wow. So, how did you go from being a science fiction writer to being a sword and soul writer?
See, this is the funny thing. The Dark Universe is actually probably some of the first science fiction I've actually written. Oh, yeah? It's easier for me to write sword and soul because I've always been a big history person, and I love history, and I'm not as hard on myself as writing history as I am about science because I'm a scientist. Uh-huh. So whenever I sit down to write science, I'm tougher on myself, mm-hmm. and that's why it's taken me so long to write anything that's been science fiction. I still have not yet written a science fiction novel. Oh. I've only written science fiction stories because I don't really feel like I'm ready yet to write a science fiction novel the way that it needs to be written, the way I feel like it needs to be written. I had 3 major ideas when I started my company. One was Meji, which is my epic fantasy sword and soul story. The other one was Changa Safari, which is my series, and the other one was a story called Metro Force, which is supposed to be a science fiction novel. I have yet to write Metro Force. Metro Force is here it is 11 years later, and Metro Force is still sitting in a box somewhere, I've written it in novel form, I've written it in script form, I just keep messing around with it, but I think I've actually even considered adapting it for the Dark Universe. But it was like maybe a few weeks ago I was looking at this manuscript and I was like, you know what? I think I'm still going to keep it as a standalone story, but I couldn't tell you when it's going to actually be written because that's just how I've been on that whole process. But yeah, the Sword and Soul is easy to me because it was like I said, I've done a lot of history. In the 90s, I went through this really I called it my African Renaissance phase, where I really started doing a lot of research on African history and culture, and that's where the Sword and Soul came from. Actually, it was a book I read by Maurice Condé called Segu, which was actually in the history section. So when I picked it up, I thought I was picking up a book about an African kingdom called Segu, which was going to be a historical book. Mm-hmm. But then when I started reading it, I realized it was a historical fiction book. And I had never read historical fiction based on African culture before, and it just blew me away. I was like, man, this is what I want to do right here. I said, this is what this woman is doing. This is what I want to do, and that's really where I got my inspiration to write Sword and Soul. Because I didn't even know Charles Saunders existed at the time. I didn't meet Charles until after I had already written Magic, and that's when we met and stuff, Mm-hmm. And but that's where that comes from. It's easy. I can sit down and write something like that a lot easier because that's what my passion is in history. So that's what I like.
Wow. Okay. So what exactly where do your main inspirations come from when you're writing Sword and Soul? I mean, like in terms of stuff like in our world.
Well, of course it comes from the history, but a lot of I get a lot of inspiration from art. Mm-hmm. My cousins that I grew up with, both of them were artists when we were younger, and they were the kind of artists that would get the comic books and they would do the history stuff like that. I mean, draw the art, the characters and stuff. I tried to do it. That's when I realized that was not my talent. My talent is in telling stories, not drawing stories. But so I've always had kind of an eye or a sensitivity to art, mm-hmm. and so a lot of times I may see artwork by an artist, and to me there will be a story in that artwork, and I'll say, man, this, I see this story here. This is about this person and that person. Sometimes I get in contact with the artist, and I'll say, hey, I love this piece of artwork. What were you thinking when you did it? Mm-hmm. And sometimes they'll have a story behind it. Sometimes they'll be like, oh, it's just something I did. I just got this idea when I did it and stuff, And then I'll share with them my idea, and they'll say, hey, that sounds pretty cool, so go for it, that kind of thing, But art is a big thing. Music is a big thing, because I'm a big music buff, and certain songs have stories behind them. Mm-hmm. And as you listen to the songs and the words, you'll say, hey, a story will start coming together, and then you start jotting down notes and stuff like that, and you have a story. But that's my real world inspirations. That I say the biggest are, some are just ideas that pop in your head. So between art and music, that's basically where most of them come from.
Okay. So I know usually you have a lot of references to using different languages such as Yoruba and Swahili and stuff. So what was that like getting diving into that?
Well, that's really the interesting part, because when I do my Sword and Soul, I try to base all my stories on a particular culture in Africa, because that gives me a base to work with. Now, once I get done with the story, it may not necessarily resemble that culture, because sometimes I do composite stuff, mm-hmm. and I always have to leave some room to do the fantasy part. I don't know enough about these cultures to write something that would be specific to that culture. Mm-hmm. I'm not Yoruba, I'm not Igbo, I'm not Zulu. There are things that goes into that culture and that tradition that as an African American I don't know. So that's why I don't try to stick too closely to a particular culture in Africa, but just learn enough about it to where I can use it and adapt it to the story I'm working with, and sometimes use composite cultures and stuff. But I focus on particular cultures to give the cultures that I'm creating a real feel. If I decide to base something on Zulu culture, then all the characters in that culture are going to have Zulu names. Mm-hmm. If I decide to use a Yoruba culture, then everybody in that culture that I'm writing that story is going to have Yoruba names, because that kind of gives you some continuity to the story. And it's also cool with a lot of my friends from different countries in Africa when they read the stories and they say, "Oh yeah, check him out. He's uses these Swahili words," and I will do that too if I'm making up a word. Mm-hmm. By taking a Swahili word and doing a composite, I will go to. I have a couple of friends of mine that are from Kenya that speak Swahili, and I'll say, "Look, this is the word I'm trying to use. What do you think about that?" And they'll say, "Okay, that's cool right there." One time I actually did a word, and I shared it with a friend of mine from Kenya, and she was like, "Nah, you don't want to use that word right there." She said because that word is a really bad word in our culture, and if somebody in our culture sees it, they're going to be kind of offended by it. So you don't want to use that word. She said instead you may want to use this word right here and stuff. So that's why I do that, because I want to make sure that whatever I work with, I'm being respectful to the culture. And I'm not taking license and assuming stuff like that, because that's what has happened with in the past with people base stuff on different African cultures, especially when you deal with European views of stuff. That's where we get Tarzan movies and stuff like that, because people are given a stereotypical view of different cultures and stuff. So that's really where it comes from, is being able to, and it's kind of fun to do it, to find these different glossaries. Like I recently found one of the Mandinka language. So one of the cultures that I'm using, I'm basing it on that culture. So I'm going through this glossary that I have of Mandinka languages and words and stuff, and I'm incorporating them into the story that I'm telling on there.
Wow, that must get kind of intense though, right? Like, I mean,
if it's fun, it doesn't bother you. It's like it's your passion and stuff, So it's not it's not work.
Right.
It's almost like solving a puzzle. It's like, as I write the story, I get to a certain thing and I say, you know what, I want to use a Mandinka word for it. I have collections of African proverbs. I have one that actually has African proverbs divided by the culture, And so maybe I say, okay, instead of just having a person explain this, I'm gonna take this and I'm gonna put it into a story. Like one I used in Meji. I remember this one. I had a character, Shange, and Shange was considered like a very formidable Sesu warrior. He was such a good warrior that even the Nkosi of the Sesu, Dingane, respected the guy and kind of feared him and stuff, So Shange is getting together some warriors that go on a cattle raid, And Shange is a kind of leader who gets people to do what he wants to do by insulting them and questioning them their masculinity and stuff, you know. And so he's having this discussion with his warriors about going on this cattle raid, and these guys are like, well, we don't know if we would. One of the guys like, I don't know if we really want to go on this thing. And so Shange says to him, you're scared of a donkey's horns. And it's actually an insult because donkeys don't have horns. But it's an African proverb. So, you know, instead of just him saying, oh, you're a coward and stuff, I said, I'm going to put this in there, you know, because this is a proverb that means that, you know. And you could read it in context and gather what it means. Yeah. But to me, the real fun of it is that someone from that culture may see that proverb. Oh yeah, and they'll really get it and stuff, and they'll be like, they'll crack up. Oh, he used this purpose. So that to me, that's fun. That's all the fun part and the enjoyable part about writing and stuff.
Oh, that's awesome. So when you started writing, like, did you get any kind of like, you know, resistance or pushback from anybody? You know, like your family members or friends. Like when you said, hey, this is my passion. This is what I'm really going to put myself into from now on.
That's a good thing about when I decided to write. Everybody that I knew, all my immediate family and people like that, they were encouraging of it. Nobody looked at me and said, hey, why are you going to write this stuff? Especially nobody looked at me and said, why are you writing science fiction fans? I just said, hey, I'm going to do this. And they were like, cool, man, you know, go for it and stuff. My wife was, when I first started out, when I would write a story, when I was doing my revisions, I actually would revise them by reading them to her out loud. And just before we go to bed, I'd bring the manuscript in and I'd start reading it to her. And while I'm reading it outside, I said, okay, I'm going to say that. I'm going to say something else. I'll draw a line through the stuff. But that's how I did it, you know. My kids used to read my books. They don't read them anymore now because they say, we don't read your books because we know how they're going to end because you talk about them all the time. you know, I mean, you know, we already know what's going to happen, you know, that kind of thing, you know. So I've never had that. I've never had anybody, even when I was younger, with my parents, like I said, they weren't, you know, saying, you know, you should make this your life work, but they were also not discouraging me from doing that. Right. You know, they weren't telling me stuff like, yeah, you know, that's good, but you need to go out and get you a real job and blah, blah, blah. They never did that stuff. They just say, if I wrote something, they would say, hey, that's pretty cool, that kind of thing, you know. But, you know, so it's kind of, so I've never had that, you know, so that's why I think, and I've talked to other writers who had to deal with that, but that's never been an issue with what I do.
Okay, great. So, like, as far as like your writing is concerned, like, what is your favorite part? Like your like, if you had to like rank like your number one favorite part of writing, what would you say it is?
It's funny because it used to be the part I worried about the most, but now I think it's probably something that I consider that I think I do the best, and that's dialogue. Mm-hmm. When I first started writing, I was really concerned about the conversations between my characters. I didn't want them to sound like they had been written. I wanted them to sound natural. Mm-hmm. I wanted the characters to have different voices so it didn't sound like, you know, every character to sound the same and stuff like that. So I really spent a lot of time studying that and working on that. And now I think when I read my stories, the thing I enjoy the most about my stories when I read them to myself is the dialogue, because I like how natural it is, and how, you know, when I have characters interacting, that it doesn't feel forced. Right. It feels like, you know, the characters are saying exactly what they need to say, exactly the way they need to say them. You know, it's not stilted. It's flowing, and especially when I have characters that know each other, you know, you get that sense of familiarity in their conversations. Mm-hmm. And stuff like. And I think it comes from studying it and just listening to yourself and to other people and how they talk to each other, mm-hmm. and kind of incorporating that into your own characters when you have conversations and stuff. So I say the part that I probably enjoy the most would be writing dialogue, that kind of stuff.
How long did it take you to become like really comfortable doing that?
By my third book, that's when I became comfortable with my style. Meji, and the way I noticed it was that normally when I review a book, every page I'm changing stuff. I don't like this, I don't like that, you know. Next page, I don't like this, I don't like that. When I wrote Changa Safari Book 2, and I was reading it, doing my first edit, reading through it, and then I came across something. I was like, okay, I don't like that. And I looked at the book and I realized I had read halfway through the book before I came across something that I didn't like. And at that point, I realized, I said, you know what? I'm there now. I got a style now that I'm confident with. I like the way I tell stories, and so this is cool, you know. And when you reach that point as a writer, to me, writing gets easier because you've got a confidence. Because really, that's the point where you've got your confidence now.
Yeah.
You know, you're confident in how you're writing. You're confident in things you're seeing, how you're putting things together, and now you find yourself doing less and less correcting, except for if it's like typos and stuff like that, because now your storytelling is exactly the way you want it to be. You know?
Yeah. Wow. Man, like, I mean, that's kind of how I feel with like the way that things have been going as far as streaming is concerned.
Mm-hmm.
Because when I started out, like, first off, when I started streaming, like you're saying, like you got a lot of support when you started writing,
Mm-hmm.
which was great. I also got a lot of support when I started streaming. Like I said, hey, I want to start streaming. And everybody was basically like, oh, great, go ahead. And I was like, really? Because like people, but the thing was, is even before I started, people had started saying, you know, hey, you'd be really good at that. And I was like, oh, really? I don't know about that. So I had plenty of encouragement even when I didn't really believe in myself.
Mm-hmm. And
it's like I said to Sebastian earlier, you know, about, it's like people can tell you, oh, you're so great all day long. But if you don't believe it, it doesn't amount to anything.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, like, but real quick, I wanted to, like, I know I asked you about this earlier during your panel, but about that game you're doing.
Well, Kakanga is that's our Sword and Soul RPG, and it actually came out of a conversation between Balagoon and I when we started talking about stuff. Balagoon is like my partner in crime, and we started talking about role-playing games, and he started talking about how, you know, black people weren't really represented. He's been playing role-playing games for 40 years, and him and I are kind of like, when we see stuff like that, we say, well, let's do something about it, man. So we started talking about building an RPG. I never played an RPG game before until we played Kakanga. But, you know, my thing was story, you know, world building and stuff like that. While we were having the conversation, this guy, we were actually getting ready to do an event, and this guy came over and said, hey, you guys talking about role-playing game? And we was like, yeah, you know. He said, well, you know, I used to do a little role-playing game writing and stuff. My name is Ed Hall. And then Balagoon said, you're the Ed Hall? I said, what are you talking about? He said, man, this guy used to work for White Wolf. He wrote this game, he wrote that game, all this kind of stuff like that. So him and I worked on the game, and once we got it done, we took it to Ed and let him look at it. He said, hey, you know, you guys wrote a pretty good game. He gave us some tips and stuff like that. So we rolled the game out through a Kickstarter a couple of years ago. So now the game is out. You know, we've got a few people playing it. We have a lot of people in Brazil that's been playing the game. And you know, it's working out pretty good. It's different than your Dungeons and Dragons because you don't use dice, you use cards. It's also different because we don't have races and ranks. We have traits and abilities and different things like that where you can actually literally build your own character. So your character doesn't have to be a warrior. Your character can be a warrior with magical abilities or a magician with warrior abilities.
That sounds great.
I think we might.
I think that might be our time, people. I'm gonna have to probably ask you back for a part 2 to supplement on the stuff I wanted to ask you.
Oh, no problem, man. No problem.
But I do appreciate you coming and talking to me right now. I mean, this was you, William, and like Sebastian. You guys were freaking amazing this week. I mean,
thank you, man.
I really thank you so much.
No problem. No problem.
Okay, everybody. So, like I said, that's our time. Thanks again to Mr. Milton Davis for coming on. I'm going to actually take this video and I'm gonna post it. And you have Twitter, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I'm gonna tag you on Twitter. I'm gonna repost it, and then get all your information out there on Discord and everything,
okay. So
people can come back and check you out and everything like that. So it's a real big deal. You know what I mean? Like I'm trying to make. Man, you have no idea. To me, this was like one of the most important things ever to be here for this event and have talk to you guys and be around you guys, because you guys are inspirations to me, especially as an upcoming content creator.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
cool. Well, thanks, man. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you. All right, everybody. That's it for the amazing experience. I will be back tomorrow night for another stream. Until then, Just remember, everything is going to be okay, because I'll be back with another amazing experience, and I'll see you then.